Meg is going to talk to us about Species Establishment Research Program at Ranger. So I hope you'll all welcome Meg. Thanks.
I'd first like to acknowledge the Larrakia people on whose land we meet today and the Mirror traditional owners where Ranger Mine is located, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm Meg Parry. As Keith said, I'm part of the rehabilitation and ecology team at Ranger Uranium Mine, working on the closure of the mine. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague Aidan Wright and my leader Dr. Ping Liu, and also Peter Christopherson, who unfortunately couldn't be with us here today. He is the owner and operator of Kakadu Native Plants, who we do a lot of work with in terms of seed collection and propagation. And this research program, a lot of his experience and knowledge underpins key aspects of our rehabilitation. So I'll just provide a quick sort of background on why we do have a allocated research establishment program. And then I'll go over some key aspects of our database where we have consolidated this knowledge and experience. So that includes overarching information on the species and then specific information on the seed, propagation and revegetation of these species. So our role at the mine is to rehabilitate local species and create an ecosystem that is similar in density and abundance and composition of that land, and it is resilient, functional, and sustainable. There is approximately over 270 species on this land. It is very rich in flora species, and as such, we needed a systematic way to learn how we're going to create this ecosystem. So this research program has come about following over 30 years of research and then some very recent, very targeted research in the last decade or so. And the SERP really is so that we can systematically study and review all of the potential plant species that we'll be using in the rehabilitation. And we're continuously still working on improving all knowledge on all aspects of this re-veg. And trying to identify the most efficient and effective way to rehabilitate the site. And I'll go into some detail on that in a second. So I'll go through this because this is kind of all well-known knowledge, but to help us with our communication with different audiences and stuff, we try to have all our knowledge consolidated into one area. So in terms of species information, that's, keeping current, current and past scientific and also Kunjami and common names of the species, what family they're part of, the life form. So that's, vines, shrubs, trees, the standard heights, the life cycle. So whether they're annual, perennial, whether they're deciduous, semi-deciduous or evergreen, whether they're sprouters or cedars. And then also aspects of their natural habitat, where they occur in the bushland. So some of them, we're predominantly focusing on a savanna woodland ecosystem, although we do have other types of ecosystems as well. And, all the different soils that they appear on, and also where have we actually surveyed them in the natural landscape surrounding Ranger. So that a lot of that comes from the work that SSB are doing in terms of their reference ecosystems and also past surveys that have been done in the area by ERA and other entities. So in terms of how can we rehabilitate and establish over 270 species, it's not really feasibly possible to actively reintroduce every single species. So we need a way of how do we prioritize which species we're going to focus our efforts on. And key things that we want to really consider in terms of this is what species have been identified desirable by our traditional owners that they would like to see as part of the re-veg. And we have approximately 60 species at this stage that have been specifically identified. And also what other foods we know are traditional bush foods that maybe haven't been specifically identified, but are identified in other literature as well. obviously what species are dominant in those surrounding landscapes, which species have ecological importance, so whether they form hollows for fauna, they are a key fauna food, so like some of our grasses, are they a legume, so they perform nitrogen fixation, all those sort of aspects we want to consider. And also lastly, things like whether they will have any potential risk to our developing ecosystem. So we're not wanting to establish anything that is potentially a pioneering species that could become over dominant and risk our small developing seedlings, and nothing with too much biomass that could bring a risk of fire as well. So although some of these species may be introduced or naturally colonized later on, we would not be actively reintroducing them during our initial stages of revegetation. And also what species are potential contingency species. So potentially they have lower densities in the natural woodland, but we know that they perform really well on our rocky waste rock substrate. So we might include them at slightly higher densities as a substitute for other species. So in terms of all that overarching classifications, we've got it down to having some key framework species that we must have that are ubiquitous in the landscape and really like Tetradonta miniata savanna woodland. We're introducing Tetradonta and miniata. Also what's important, so those cultural species, and then what are other potential species that we might have at some sites but we don't at others, or they might be very particular in what habitat they need, so they'll be in a fire protected area. So all these sort of overarching things we keep in mind in terms of our establishment research program. Okay, so I'm just going to go straight on to seed, and that's a lovely photo of Christo collecting some seed for us. So in terms of key knowledge that we need in terms of collecting seed and storing seed is knowledge of our species phenology. So when it's flowering and fruiting, and collection. So what's the best method for collection? How variable is it with the seasons? So for some of our species, they only have a good seeding year every 5 to 7 years, and others we can consistently count on fruiting every year. What sort of quantities are we able to collect? So for some, you're lucky in an hour, you can get 100, whereas others you can get thousands of seed. And how easy is it to collect? Does it take 1 hour? Does it take 10 hours? So all these aspects we need to really be knowledgeable on so that we can be well planned in terms of getting all our seed requirements in time for our massive revegetation that will be taking place in a couple of years. Also a key aspect of seed is how can we store it? So we know with some of our framework species, they can store upwards of 10 years, and others have very perishable seed, which we need to collect every year. And then other risks and controls in terms of collecting seed. So that's in terms of, is there any safety risks, or do we know that they're particularly vulnerable to any insects or pests? Are they really vulnerable to wildfire? So again, all of these aspects we need to have a lot of knowledge on in terms of doing good planning for our future re-veg. And again, I'd like to say that a lot of this is really underpinned by Kakadu native plants experience and working on the land. And yeah, just want to highlight that. Going on to propagation. So some key aspects for us is, of course, seed treatment. So which of our seed can we throw in a pot and it grows? Which ones need some special treatment to help break that dormancy? Some of it is, typical heat treatment. Some of it is just storing it for a longer period of time, trialing with mulch and that sort of thing. We do have some tricky customers, which we're still figuring out. And, we are currently doing some trials at the moment and looking at enhancing the germination of some of our species. And what's really tricky in terms of the ranger revegetation is because we're currently required to do our massive re-veg in 1 to 2 years, it means that we are required to revegetate throughout the year, so in all different seasons. So this is quite new territory for us. So we found some of our species are fine germinating throughout the year, but others during those colder seasons when they're typically not germinating and growing, we're having to experiment with things like a shade house. So we're currently doing a lot of those trials at the moment. Also looking at growth, again, some of our species only need 4 weeks to grow and others need 6 months. And then the growing in different seasons, again, complicates this aspect. And then we've got key risks. So for things like those fresh fruited perishable seeds, how do we revegetate at the end of the year when we've had that seed for 9 months? So now we're trialing aspects of growing those seedlings throughout the year so that we're planting older plants. We're also trialing things like different pots methods as well, like plastic pots and biopots, that sort of thing. Yeah, so lots of work happening in the propagation aspect of it. And then our actual re-veg. So the whole point of this database as well is to consolidate all our knowledge. There's been over 30 years of research done on re-veg. So for some of our species, we've got a lot of material to go on and experience to go on. And we've still got some species that we're just now getting experience growing it on waste rock. Looking at different introduction methods. So predominantly at this stage, we'll be doing tube stock planting, but we have also looked at direct seeding. We've looked at creating ecological islands of bringing in material. And we're also taking note of what species colonize naturally into our waste rock with no help from us. Also key things like planting conditions, you know, is a plant dying off when it's got some waterlogging, or is it tolerant to waterlogging? Do some species prefer really rocky waste rock or finer waste rock? How do they perform during the dry season? How does a deciduous species go when it's planted in the middle of the dry season when it's naturally dormant? And then looking at more long-term species establishment. So how does it go in the first 2 years in the waste rock versus how is it performing after 10 years? What sort of senescing are we seeing? What sort of development are we seeing? So just because something's got initial high survival doesn't mean it'll necessarily be present after 5 to 10 years. Also very interested if obviously having a resilient ecosystem and a sustainable ecosystem, you need to be having the flowering and fruiting of those key species and the recruitment, so your next generations coming in. And then natural colonization. So what we've seen, and my colleague Ping will talk on this a bit later, is that once these ecosystems, these artificially created ecosystems start developing and you get the soil development and collection of organic matter and some of that fauna coming in, we're seeing a lot more passive colonization coming into our ecosystems, which is really exciting. And lastly, we're doing a lot of work in how to optimize our re-veg method. So as I said before, we're trialing out some biopots versus plastic pots, how that impacts the survival and performance, but also how that impacts doing large scale re-veg. We are also going to be looking at mechanical planting, all sorts of different methods for trying to really optimize how we can get the best result in terms of our re-veg. We've also identified that some of our species probably aren't suitable for being introduced in the first few years when everything's developing. But once there's shade and other aspects of the ecosystem, they perform much better then. So we've deferred certain species during different timelines of the ecosystem development. And then key issues and risks. So how species respond to fire, how species respond to weed, the species that aren't necessarily suited to the substrate, how can we enhance their performance? Yeah, all those sort of things as well. So it's very targeted, species-specific program, trying to understand all aspects of our revegetation and rehabilitation. And that work is still ongoing, and we're still learning and still performing trials to this day. So it's a constantly dynamic document that's still being updated so that we can really perform the best rehabilitation possible in the next couple of years. And we do have a little booth set up outside with some of our seedlings and seeds. And we'll all be over there during the afternoon tea. So I welcome anyone to come over and have a chat with us about the work that we're doing.
Just wondering how, when you plant not in the rainy season, do you plant in the dry season as well?
Yeah, so at the moment we're performing trials in that we're planting all year round. So we're doing the wet season, the dry season, and also the build-up, because at current schedule is that we will need to perform re-veg all year round. So we'll need to be growing them and planting them all year round, including the dry season.
So the sequel to the question is, then do you irrigate what you plant?
Yep. So our current prescription is that we are committed to irrigate for up to the first 6 months. So obviously that's crucial during the dry season and into the build-up when those temperatures are really hot. We also are committed to doing irrigation during the wet season. Obviously that will be dependent on the type of wet season that we get. You know, some years we probably won't even need to turn it on, but other years our plants will be dependent on that because we know how variable the wet seasons can be up here. So at the moment, we are committed to up to 6 months of irrigation for our newly planted tube stock.
Greg McDonald from the Northern Land Council. I understand you're constrained by the time frame that you mentioned earlier. Do you think that a longer time could lead to better outcomes in terms of the biodiversity and the revegetation outcomes that you're hoping to achieve?
I think, well, in terms of, you know, our level of knowledge generally is on performing re-veg in the wet season. So a lot of the experience and knowledge that we draw on is from that time. So at the moment, we are doing a lot of work to try and make up for that knowledge in terms of doing it during the other seasons. If it was extended, that would take some of those issues out of the equation. But we are trying to be prepared for doing it during that allocated time frame. In terms of meeting biodiversity, I don't see it as being as much of a risk in terms of we are also committed to things like infill planting and you know, additional species introductions if we're not meeting that species richness targets. So although it does make potentially the initial stages of getting that ecosystem up and running more challenging, meeting those biodiversity and species richness indicators, you know, in the 25, 30 years to come, I don't see the initial seasonality aspects as impacting it.
Hi, cool. Hi, I'm Michael from the Centre for Mine Site Restoration over in WA. Following on from that a little bit with the biodiversity side of it, you mentioned you guys have about 270 species you're dealing with. Do you have any idea from a dormancy point of view, how many of those are still forming a real barrier and are proving problematic?
So in terms of the way that we are trying to look at the collection of our species as a whole, in terms of our framework species and our important species, we do still have some key species that we are still getting challenged in terms of germination. Whereas, so of those 270 plus species, many of them are very, very, very low presence, and we have seen many of them coming in passively on our older re-veg sites. So we are trying to really focus our area on about 70 species, really. And in terms of those, there's still some that we do need to work on and that have been identified as risks. But the majority of them, we are seeing successful, you know, seed collection, propagation, and then re-veg. So our work over the next year or so is really focusing on optimizing the ones that we already know we can do, and then really figuring out those tricky customer species that we know not only are fairly dominant, but also culturally important.
Hi, Glenn Christie from Succession Ecology in South Australia. You mentioned colonisers, in particular regarding the waste rock area, which looks to be your challenge. So I'm curious about what you've seen and what plant species you've identified in terms of a coloniser and succession process. What are those ones? Because they're not the same thing as your climax species.
So we do have a particular pioneering acacia shrub, Acacia holocyracea, that we know not only is potentially not actually natural to that area, a area further away, but it also, so it's potentially not considered a native. And it also is an aggressive dominant pioneering species. So in terms of having this disturbed waste rock, we have seen that it colonizes our waste rock dumps. It readily recruits onto our waste rock ecosystem landforms. So we do have an active program in terms of managing that species, at least initially in the first couple of years while our ecosystem is developing. There's also a couple of key sort of understory species that, again, we've seen colonizing those waste rocks. And so dependent on the level of biomass and how actively it recruits, we also manage the introduction of those species as well. So basically, yeah, we've got one main acacia that is of concern and a couple of grasses as well. And in terms of once the ecosystem's developed, what we've seen, and again, my colleague will talk on it a bit more with our 12-year-old waste rock ecosystem, is that we had fairly minimal colonization of desirable native species for up to 8 to 10 years. We had some weed colonization, but it hit about the 10-year mark, and then we've suddenly seen, an upfold of colonizing from not only understory, annual and perennial species, but also some mid-story species as well. So it seems that we've sort of hit that critical point where we've got those key aspects of the ecosystem that are desirable for those species to start coming in on their own, and birds are coming in and bringing seed as well. So yeah, there seems to be this sort of critical point where shade, nutrients, microsite is all perfect for these species to start coming in, and that's what we've been seeing the last few years.
Oh, very quick. If I can make a suggestion, in arid areas, I've used sterilised wood fibre mulch to get those grasses started first up at any time of the year, getting the insulation and a bit of moisture retention.
Yeah, so we are interested in looking at organic matter. I actually have performed some trials back in my honours on our landform, looking at bringing in organic matter and a shallow, a thin layer of litter and stuff.
Generally 5 to 10 tonne, you can only do about 6 to 7 hectares a day.
Yeah, well, we are limited in terms of being in Kakadu National Park. So there are some key restrictions in terms of bringing material from outward in. And then, so we would need to collect from within the park, really within our ranger project area, and then locating an environment that's, doesn't have the weed source and where we can ethically collect enough. It does have a couple of unique challenges in that aspect, but definitely would love to chat more if you want to come over and see us at our booth. Yeah, thank you.